30 years worth of hindsight. I think for me, the line would have worked better if Batman said, in my case, accomplishing that was easy. I've always wanted certain people to fear me. His line about something unreal, something unnatural, turning the people against Superman, I do like that line. I think that is important because very early on in the post-crisis era, between The Dark Knight Returns and Man of Steel, it was established that Superman and Batman were not and would not be friends in the post-crisis DCU. They certainly got off to a rather shaky start in John Byrne's Man of Steel, and there was that climactic confrontation between the older Superman and Batman in Dark Knight Returns. And I'm sure it was very jarring for younger readers who had grown up learning about the DCU, not just through reading comic books, but also by watching Super Friends, wherein Superman and Batman were clearly the best of friends. So it is nice here to have this line to show concern on Batman's part, to show that even though they're not friends, Batman still realizes that Superman is not a villain, and it's not right for people to be afraid of the Man of Steel. I just want to zero in on the end of the confrontation between Captain Boomerang, Flash Wally West, and Changeling. Going right to the end where the angry crowd abducts Captain Boomerang, and Wally says, "We've got to rescue Boomerang from those folks before they," and then he's cut off by Dr. Fate. Now, certainly, if it was Barry Allen in this position, he would not have allowed Captain Boomerang to be lynched by this group. But something that became a key component of Wally West's characterization over the course of his evolution in the post-crisis and pre-Flashpoint eras was that he was somebody who went out not just to bring criminals to justice, but he was also out to help them in general. And he had the greatest success with Pied Piper and Trickster, but he became known as the Flash who would speak to the rogues, tried to figure out what was going on with them, tried to see if there was something that drove them to be who they were, and then showed honest concern in wanting to turn things around for them. And so it really starts here, you could say, with issue 5 of Legends, where despite Captain Boomerang embarrassing him in front of a crowd, in front of his good friend Gar, he still snaps to and says, "We've got to rescue Boomerang." All right, now going to page 15 in the Oval Office. I wonder how well or how differently a scene like this would play out if it were written today with the current president who we have sitting in the Oval Office. Given that the current version of Superman is one who has elements of the histories of both the pre-Flashpoint and New 52 Superman, but whose characterization is based primarily on the post-crisis Superman. I would say that if Superman were sitting in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, he'd still be cordial. I'm just not sure that would go to the same level of cordiality with which Superman is affording President Reagan here. I think the scene, though, is comforting for readers today, given how a lot of people feel about the current president of the United States. I don't think that the president's mentioning of Superman following the presidential edict to not operate in public is anything that brings Superman down or makes him weaker. Rather, in 1986 and 87, Superman was still clearly the flagship character of the DCU. And even though this was a time when comics were getting more mature, getting darker, it was still very important that Superman be the one who was there to say and do the right things, especially during a time of crisis such as Legends. So I think this scene here is even more comforting for readers in 2017 compared to how it played out in 1987. Now, as to Superman's reference to Darkseid snatching him earlier that day, that's a callback to a three-part story which ran through issue 3 of Superman, second volume of Superman, that is, issue 426 of The Adventures of Superman, and issue 586 of Action Comics. That was a great story in which Clark Kent was actually transported to Apokolips because even though Darkseid ordered Desaad to bring Superman to Apokolips, he was in his Clark Kent guise at that time, and Superman attempted to turn things around on Apokolips, but he ended up being seduced and mind-controlled by Granny Goodness, and he ended up going on a campaign of slaughtering warhounds and shock troopers before having his mind restored by Mother Box, thanks to Orion and Lightray. And in the end of that adventure, Superman was teleported back by Darkseid, since Superman was able to defeat Darkseid in battle, and his memories of slaughtering all of those warhounds and shock troopers was wiped by Orion, who didn't want Superman to bear the burden of such memories, such experiences. As for Dr. Fate, talking about serving a higher authority, during the whole post-crisis era, it was established that Dr. Fate was an agent of the Lords of Order and Chaos, and so in various stories, we did see him dealing with a higher authority. Okay, flipping to the scene in Metropolis where the people want Captain Boomerang to be hung or burned or fed to the warhounds. Just something really neat here, showing that G. Gordon Godfrey wasn't targeting just the costumed heroes, but targeting the costumed villains as well. I'm sure there were a number of readers who are wondering, hey, if Godfrey and Darkseid are somehow successful in their campaign, are they just going to let the costume villains run loose all over Earth? And of course here, the answer we get is no. I just want to put on page 17, we have a television screen that Waller and Flag are looking at. This speaks to the whole trend in 80s comics and media where you'd see a lot of TV screens, a lot of the action being told through what people were seeing on screens and monitors. Certainly a lot of that was done in New Teen Titans and Crisis on Infinite Earths. Frank Miller used that technique in Dark Knight Returns, but here we see it being used as well in Legends. And the whole dialogue between Waller and Flag just goes to show that in this post-crisis era, the heroes didn't see things in terms of black and white. There were considerable shades of gray to which various heroes or authority figures, costumed or civilian, were willing to go to. The scene on page 19 with Godfrey at the Lincoln Memorial and that huge crowd is pretty impressive. I remember growing up in the 80s, and it was a time when there were people who were speaking out against the government. There had certainly been a number of protests held in the U.S. in the 60s and the 70s. But this was 86, 87. The economy hadn't bottomed out. So I think this scene here of all the angry rioters assembling in front of Godfrey probably speaks more to readers in North America today than when 1986, 87. I'm thinking 30 years ago, readers would probably have looked at the scene and said, yeah, could that really happen so much over here? All right, and then page 20, the great scene where we've got Fate with his assembled group of champions looking at Superman. John Byrne has said in interviews that he did take inspiration from the original Richard Donner Superman movie, and that when he was penciling Superman, he did try to put some of Christopher Reeve in his Superman. Gary Frank is the master of drawing a Christopher Reeve-inspired Superman, but you can see some of Christopher Reeve in the bottom right corner of page 20. Guy Gardner looks older than everybody else. He appears older throughout this series, in fact. I kind of like it because it suggests that Guy's whole pre-crisis history was still intact. And this was a man who, yeah, his superhero career was relatively young, but he did start out as a Green Lantern years earlier and had been rendered comatose, of course, out of action for a number of the ensuing years. No doubt on page 20, a lot of readers thought this is the big payoff, this is our new Justice League, but as I'll discuss further in my review of the final issue of Legends, this was not to be the case. All right, just jumping ahead to the last page with Jason Todd. This is clearly the pre-crisis Jason Todd. Issue number 408, which introduced the post-crisis Jason Todd, or rather the post-crisis characterization of Jason Todd, had not been released yet. And so DC's editorial rule was, until a hero or character has received their post-crisis origin, their pre-crisis history and characterization stays intact. But I think that's important given the story which we were dealing with here. If this was the post-crisis Jason Todd, who did things which almost got himself and Batman killed, probably would have run contradictory to this story or his participation in the story. And then seeing that final panel with Darkseid laughing just speaks to every issue except for issue number 2, ending with a visual of Darkseid laughing or boasting about what he sees as his impending victory. Okay, folks, just to let you know, for episode number 114, I am finally going to give a long overdue tribute to my friend Chris Ivey and his former podcast From Kid to Flash, with a spoiler-filled discussion of the return of Barry Allen's storyline from the early 1990s. And then for episode 115, I'm going to wrap up my Cole's Notes treatment of DC's Legends. So until we meet again in another couple of weeks, this class is dismissed.